And I will also say that we welcome, as somebody maybe noted a moment ago, COVID has many obvious downsides, but one of the upsides and the silver lining for these presentations is we get to invite and have people participate from near and far. And I've seen that some of the people that have signed up today are from other chapters, and we heartily welcome them. We've got one participant from the Aloha chapter, and somebody mentioned San Diego. And we also welcome our friends and neighbors at the GW chapter down in Washington, where Jennifer does her work at Brookings. So welcome to all of you. And we're glad you can participate in this presentation. I also wanted to take a minute to welcome two new members to our chapter, Seema Eiler and Brandon Schultz. We're delighted to have them join our party band here, and look forward to inducting them when the appropriate time comes. We do have a good schedule coming up for future presentations, and for those of you that are on now and on with us for the first time, please note that these presentations are FREE, which is the price is right. So for the moment, at least, that's what we're offering. So again, we're delighted to have you participate and make use of this wonderful resource, which we think as a chapter we can provide. And with that, Nate, do you want to tell us what's coming up for next month?
Sure. On May 19th, we will have a presentation on construction costs. They've certainly been going up quite a bit in recent months. Our speakers will be Chip Lamberson. Chip is a vice president of cost and estimating at Whiting Turner, and so certainly well on top of costs. And in addition, we will have Michael Denise, who's a senior advisor in the strategic and advisory services divisions of Cushman and Wakefield. So we're looking forward to that presentation. And then on June 16th, we're going to have a presentation on the Greenway Trail Network with a speaker from Trail Nation for Rails and Trails Conservatory, as well as a speaker from the City of Baltimore Department of Planning. Okay, yeah, we're now up to about 45 on the call. I imagine there'll be more. We had 63 signed up, so we're doing well. But with regard to our topic today, I should say that a few months ago, we had a presentation by Stephen Walters, and his presentation was people should not, local governments should not be worrying about specific projects, but they should be worried about the general nature of taxation in the community, and placemaking will take care of itself. We have a different slant on that today. Our speaker is Jennifer Vey. Jennifer is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, and she is a director of the Ann T. and Robert M. Bass Center for Transformative Placemaking. And she focuses primarily on place-based policies and practices and how they can generate widespread economic, social, and environmental benefits. She's author of dozens of Brookings Institution. She co-edited Retooling for Growth, Building a 21st Century Economy in America's Older Industrial Areas. And prior to coming to Brookings in 2001, she was a community planning and development specialist at HUD. She has a master's of planning degree from UVA and a BA in geography from Bucknell. She does live in Baltimore, and many of you may remember her from her 2016 talk before our group. She's also a volunteer with Barco, the Baltimore Arts State Corporation, as well as with the Neighborhood Design Center. With that, I'll introduce you to Jennifer Bay.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate that warm introduction, and I'm happy to be back. Happy to see all of you today, if only virtually. Hopefully we'll get back there soon where we can all be in rooms together. Hopefully we're not that far off.
So if I
So what I'm
turn
going to do, pardon me? I'm going to share my screen, so just bear with me for a moment while I kind of get set up here.
Okay, yeah, and Jennifer, or all of you out there, if you have questions, put them in the chat and we will get to them when Jennifer's talk is completed.
Okay. All right.
And could everyone mute unless, of course, you're the speaker?
Great. So again, thanks so much to all of you for being here today. So as Nathan said, I'm going to really focus my remarks on this whole concept around transformative placemaking. Why and how cities and regions like Baltimore around the country really, we feel ought to kind of embrace this, what we're really, this is like theory of change in order to expand opportunities for people and places. So it was in November of 2018 that the Brookings Institution launched the Ante and the Bass Center for Transformative Placemaking, which I direct, with the mission of inspiring public and private and civic sector leaders to make transformative place investments that generate widespread social and economic benefits. So I'm going to talk to you today about why we established the center and why these reasons are important to you and to your work. So in the first place, while place has always mattered to people and economies, new technologies, demographic trends, and economic shifts are altering the need and the demands for place. And we really need to better understand those demands and what they mean for our communities, both now and in the future. So second, we already know that these trends are having many positive impacts, but those benefits are not being equally distributed. Rather, the knowledge economy is just leaving too many people and far too many places behind. And so that really brings me to the third reason we created the center. If market and demographic trends are going to work for more people and places, then public and private and civic sector leaders need transformative investments in places and in placemaking to be just a key part of their overall solution set. So first, we know that new technologies, demographic trends, and economic shifts are just changing the needs and the demands for place. So we know that place has always mattered to people and the economy in ways that are constantly evolving. So in the 19th century, American cities grew to become not only centers of commerce and of trade, but really powerhouses of invention and of industry. And then within these cities, the variable needs of artisans and retailers and other businesses, of big manufacturing firms, of workers, all determined where and how these things all clustered together, giving rise to the growth of our downtowns and of our industrial districts. Of course, the demands for place dramatically changed during the 20th century. The advent of the automobile, coupled with new infrastructure investments, housing and land use policies, and the changing demands of industry led to the move of people and jobs from central cities to greener and frankly, whiter suburban pastures, while leaving many urban communities in economic and fiscal decline. So this changing relationship between place and economy has given us the very patterns of concentration, of dispersion, and of racial and economic segregation that still really characterize our cities and our suburbs today. But of course, these patterns aren't static. As with past innovations, today's digital revolution is enabling the creation of new products and services that really have the potential to improve our health and our environment and our overall quality of life. But the digital revolution is also causing some really disruptive impacts on our growth and on our development patterns. So first, the desire for greater collaboration among firms and workers, together with an overall rise in the sharing economy, is causing higher demand for density and proximity that help facilitate that kind of interaction and exchange of ideas, certainly, as well as physical items from housing. So think Airbnb to transportation, Lyft and Uber, to even things like tools. So think about, like here, the Station North Library, for example, all enabled by density and proximity. While COVID-19 has obviously really dampened a lot of these trends in ways, frankly, as much as people try to predict, I don't think we fully can quite yet. We really believe that these are broad forces that will outlive the pandemic. So second, as more, and of course with COVID, more shoppers go online, the country's retail landscape is really being dramatically shaken. But there are also other trends at play in the sector, with the real estate industry kind of visibly struggling to deliver brick and mortar retail product in the right locations. Many establishments located in auto-centric suburban shopping malls, for example, are becoming obsolete. We see this, around the country in the landscape, and just in need of a new purpose. And while retail in walkable areas is in high demand, only about 12% of retail square footage in the top 30 MSAs around the country is actually located in these kind of areas. These trends will likely continue to have some pretty potent impacts, both on how and where we shop, and of course for employees in the retail sector where we work as well. And then finally, the rise of flexible and remote work, really accelerated by the global pandemic, but growing before the pandemic certainly as well, is changing companies' needs for fixed office space. While the full implications of all these shifts, again, aren't completely known, we do know that there will be impacts both across regions and within them, in both cities, particularly downtowns, and suburbs alike. Among other things, these shifts might not bode so well for isolated, antiquated, or poorly designed office developments whose purpose is becoming increasingly irrelevant. So all these disruptions caused by the digital revolution are also occurring in tandem with a pretty powerful demographic revolution that's having its own complementary impacts on place, with diversifying population, changing household structures, leading to increased demand for new forms of housing and more walkable, vibrant communities in which to live and to work and to recreate. So we know that these trends are yielding a lot of positive impacts, and I'm going to talk about that, but they're also leaving way too many people and places behind. So taken together, these trends are yielding a lot of good impacts. After decades of sprawl and suburban dominance, many US cities have been experiencing rebounding populations, growing employment, and new public and private sector investments in infrastructure, real estate, and in placemaking. This revitalization is leading to new or revitalized areas of economic activity here in Baltimore and around the country, particularly in historic downtowns, along waterfronts, and more recently in innovation districts where research institutions and entrepreneurs cluster and connect. These trends are also leading to a pretty rapid rise of more mixed use and walkable suburban districts as well. So indeed, the demand for density is increasing. Telework was growing even before the pandemic, yet nationwide, jobs in the information sector particularly were still physically clustering at an accelerated rate, as companies have been seeking out the benefits of specialized talent and of knowledge spillovers. Here in the Baltimore metro area, for example, job density increased about 21% from 2010 to 2018, from about 11,000 jobs per square mile to about 14,000 jobs per square mile. And the job density of the city increased even more by about 28% during the post-recession period, with job growth concentrating mostly in already dense parts of the city, including downtown and adjacent areas along the waterfront, as well as around JHU, around Bayview, and around Violetville in the southwest part of the city and into the county. Outside the city, job density was also high in large suburbs along major highways and also in places like Towson and Columbia. These patterns and this concentration of metro area jobs here were driven a little bit less by the information sector, even though we saw that pattern, across the country. A lot of the trends, as you can see from this chart, were driven by the information sector. Here, they were actually driven a little bit more by corporate headquarters and professional services, as these business service jobs tended to cluster closer to each other, as well as to jobs in other sectors of the economy. Like jobs in transportation and warehousing and arts and entertainment also grew denser during this kind of post-recession period. So, again, we don't fully yet know how COVID is going to impact all these trends over the long term, but we may actually find that increased telework and sort of hybrid models of work could be an important part of the flexibility that actually makes some of this intense clustering even more feasible. So why do we even care about job density? Well, for one thing, these trends are really important to follow because for cities and for other communities, particularly those that were suffering from years of job and population loss, particularly in the last century, and in some cases even into this one, increases in job density are actually producing some pretty welcome effects. Research by my team found that metro areas that saw an overall increase in job density saw faster economic and job growth, as well as improvements in overall prosperity. Evidence also shows that density and proximity also generate more innovation. So in 2017, in a 2017 Brookings, Scott Andes had found that universities that are located in downtown areas actually outpace non-urban universities on a whole range of innovation indicators, from licensing deals to the number of startups. And this may actually help explain why advanced industry firms and entrepreneurs have been increasingly moving to be in the orbit of these big institutions. And then finally, Chris Lineberger, Tracy Haddon-Lowe, and others have been demonstrating that walkable places yield strong premiums in housing, retail, and office rents over those in drivable suburban areas, which in turn can have a positive fiscal impact on regenerating places. Okay, so for all these positive effects, we also know that the knowledge economy is leaving far too many people and far too many places behind. So in the first place, the knowledge economy is favoring tech-oriented workers over those without digital skills. Brookings research has shown that workers in highly digital occupations, things like software developers or even financial managers, far out-earn those in low digital occupations like cooks or, say, security guards. More than that, these higher wages are disproportionately going to some groups of workers over others. So for example, while Black, Latino, and Asian workers comprise 37% of the total US workforce, they represent almost 50% of those employed in low-tech jobs like personal care aides, food service, and construction. Conversely, several of these groups are significantly underrepresented in higher skilled, higher wage occupations. So not only are these inequities impacting people, but they're also dividing places too. If you look across the country, the digital economy is rewarding large global centers that are attracting innovative companies and highly educated workers, while many older industrial cities, heartland, and other non-coastal communities, particularly smaller and mid-sized cities and more rural towns, are really struggling to keep pace. Brookings research found that since 2005, only 5 metro areas, Boston, the San Francisco Bay Area, San Jose, Seattle, and San Diego, account for fully 90% of all US growth in innovation sector jobs. During this period, Baltimore more or less kind of flatlined, both in terms of adding jobs altogether, but also in terms of their overall share of these jobs across the country. In addition, while downtowns across the country are generally experiencing growth, this is a good thing, and that's true for Baltimore as well, big city downtowns on the coast are seeing far more growth in their downtowns than their smaller counterparts, again, in the Midwest and in large parts of the South. So not only are a lot of these trends, affecting the country when you look across regions, but a lot of these exact same trends, sort of these winner-take-all kind of trends, are also playing out within regions. Pretty recent research by the Economic Innovation Group shows how in the post-recession period, already prosperous areas within metros added firms and jobs, while other communities, those that weren't already doing very well, continue to face decline and disinvestment. The consequences of this disinvestment have been really devastating, with disadvantage across a whole range of indicators concentrating in low-income census tracts. Recent research by my staff found that nationwide, census tracts with high concentrations of low-income residents had higher share of residents working in service occupations, most of which are low wage, a larger percent of households with no internet, and a far lower share of homeowners than in low need tracts, meaning census tracts that aren't designated as high need by any recent public sector academic kind of indices. Low-income neighborhoods also have a disproportionate concentration of Black and Latino residents, while tracts not designated as high need are overwhelmingly white. These spatial disparities were created and reinforced by decades of housing and land use policies and practices that devalued, segregated, and sometimes just physically destroyed low-income and minority communities. This has left many people of color, even those with higher incomes, concentrated in areas that are not only home to many low-income families, but that often lack the businesses, services, and amenities that are enjoyed by their higher income residents. Certainly we see this here in Baltimore. But the key here is that these are businesses and services and amenities that also help people access employment and build wealth. Again, nowhere is this more true than Baltimore. So in short, place matters. These aren't just places that concentrate low-income people or concentrate minority populations, but by virtue of disadvantage, by virtue of not having businesses and services, amenities, and broadband, they actually help people, keep people down, essentially. So all this brings me to the third reason we established the Bass Center, and really what motivates all the work that we do. So as I've described, major market and demographic forces are altering the demands for place, yielding rewards for some people and for some communities, but not so much in others. So in an era that's really marked by stark inequities, by income and wealth, by race and ethnicity, by geography, local and regional leaders from big cities to small towns are hungry, and we see this in our work, are very hungry to harness these kind of forces in ways that actually produce more widespread economic benefits. So all this really provides an urgency and a tremendous opportunity to just reimagine our approach to place and to help communities invest in transformative solutions and in what we call transformative placemaking at a scale and with an ambition to meet the needs of businesses and people wherever they may live and work. So what sets transformative placemaking apart? I think many people are familiar with the term placemaking. So why do we put transformative in place in front of that? Why is this in our name? So in the first place, this is about scope. So transformative placemaking is really about investments that not only to create high quality places, but to support regionally significant communities that generate broad-based and locally led prosperity. With this expanded scope, that again goes beyond just kind of creating great places, means that we're talking about a bigger scale. So these are investments not just in lots or blocks or plazas or parks, but really in kind of hubs or districts where economic and physical and civic assets really cluster and connect with one another. And the biggest thing that really sets transformative placemaking apart is this integrated approach. So what we're really trying to do at the Bass Center is to try to elevate transformative placemaking as a new form of integrated practice that creates regionally significant places that are economically dynamic, where the built environment is accessible and sustainable, and that are socially and culturally inclusive. This holistic vision for places also requires critical civic engagement and hyperlocal governance structures where residents, workers, businesses, and other stakeholders can work together to determine economic, built environment, and social environment outcomes in their communities, and then organize around and advocate for strategies to help those communities achieve them. So I'll highlight just a few examples to illustrate kind of what do we mean by transformative placemaking in practice. So as I said, first, transformative placemaking strives to nurture a connected, creative, economic ecosystem in place. So in Chattanooga, for example, in 2015, they designated about 140 acres of their downtown as an innovation district. offering a range of innovation economy assets and amenities that are all served by, for them, that a publicly owned, it's one of the only publicly owned smart grid and fiber network. But soon after this innovation district actually gained support from prospective tenants and institutions that were already there, it became clear that while it had enormous economic potential to be a real driver for the community, it also risked further segmenting a place that was already marked by some pretty sharp economic and geographic divisions. So to help ensure that this didn't occur, public sector, economic development entities, and the communities themselves have worked to partner together on a whole range of initiatives, from broadband initiatives to skills training to small business development kind of supports to ensure digital equity. So second, transformative placemaking supports a built environment that's accessible and resilient. So for example, in Memphis, which is a majority Black city, as is Baltimore, the River Parks Partnership focused on increasing connectivity between neighborhoods and generating greater neighborhood investment through improvements to the parks that lie in the Mississippi. And they introduced free programming that attracts a whole diversity of residents to the park. The organization also embeds principles of equity in just their general operations, from things like staff development to contractor development, such that not only are they trying to transform the physical space of this riverfront in ways to really bring diverse groups of people together, but they're also leveraging their own power, the power of their own organization, for transformative gains for people from the region, many of which have been long, and historically excluded from economic growth and development. Transformative placemaking also strives to foster a vibrant and cohesive social environment that's really reflective of the community and the community's identity. So for example, realizing that residents of surrounding neighborhoods weren't using many of the public spaces that they designed and or maintained, a few years ago, the University City District in Philadelphia launched what they call their Just Spaces initiative to try to get at the heart of why people weren't using these spaces and to draw a plan for actually engaging a broader diversity of the local population. So they designed a web-based tool to try to capture key metrics around, who's using these spaces, at what time of day, who's not there. And then they're using that kind of information along with really deep community input to help inform their programming and design decisions in the public realm to ensure that the spaces that they're designing actually serve and are welcoming to the surrounding neighborhoods. And finally, transformative placemaking, this fourth piece of the puzzle here, encourages robust civic engagement and structures. So in Washington, for example, the 11th Street Bridge Park is an effort that's led by a place governance organization called Building Bridges Across the River to focus on creating a public park that will be perched over the Anacostia River. The organization had hundreds of community meetings over a couple of years to design a project that meets the aspirations of the neighborhoods that it'll connect and serve. So beyond their focus on the park itself, through this process, they also developed what they call an equitable development plan for the area that's focused on business and workforce development, housing, and cultural equity strategies, all aimed at driving inclusive growth in this broader geography. So, well, what I did here was just to highlight, each of these examples efforts around, one particular part of the transformative placemaking framework. Each one really also exemplifies the whole integrated nature of their efforts. So Chattanooga's efforts around digital inclusion are targeted at creating a connected and locally led innovation ecosystem. But this is done in part by investing in built environment assets such as parks and public innovation spaces that then in turn also help nurture a vibrant and cohesive social environment in the area. And this was all made possible by building a strong civic infrastructure of hyperlocal organizations and partnerships that have set a vision for the innovation district and are implementing strategies focused on achieving that vision over time. Similarly, if you look at the 11th Street Bridge project, it exemplifies how, by virtue of their civic organizing and advocacy, they were able to expand the scope and the scale of their efforts over time. So they began with this major physical project, the bridge park across the river that was aimed at creating new green and recreational space and fostering kind of a more cohesive social environment by virtue of physically connecting two neighborhoods, one booming, Capitol Hill, and one that's been historically excluded in Anacostia. But by deeply engaging with the community residents, organizers identified a whole range of other needs and opportunities around business assistance and workforce development, leading ultimately to the creation of the equitable development plan that I mentioned earlier. So, in short, by focusing on outcomes for a community, for a place, the intersectionality of challenges and solutions becomes far more apparent. So how do we go about delivering these outcomes? Well, to sum it up, leaders need new knowledge, they need new practices and tools, and they also need new policy and investment strategies that better support place-led development. So first, public and private and civic sector leaders across the country need new knowledge about where their assets are clustered within regions, the varied and unique role that these hubs play in their regional economies, particularly in those kind of areas where a lot of these assets have just largely gone unrecognized, and how that then in turn should inform where and how to prioritize economic development, infrastructure, and other kinds of investments. Second, this knowledge must in turn inform new land use, infrastructure, and economic development policies and investment strategies, in zoning and land use, in sidewalks, in transit, and business development that support and connect these hubs in ways that increase economic growth and opportunity. These policies and investment strategies should be designed to meet clearly articulated outcomes and not simply to be kind of reactive to the latest federal policy or some other windfall opportunity that comes down the pike. And then finally, this knowledge needs to support the implementation of new practices and new tools within these hubs, so not just across, but within them, that are more responsive to shifting demands in how and where we live and work and shop, including by helping to build the capacity of hyper-local governance structures so that communities can design and implement a vision and strategies that drive transformative placemaking outcomes. So by doing so, leaders have a real opportunity to build a better post-COVID future and to ensure that our cities and our regions are more economically and fiscally prosperous, more sustainable and more resilient, and provide greater equity and opportunity for all. So thanks, and I think we have some time for some questions and some discussion, so I'll stop sharing my screen.
Sure. Yeah, Jennifer, first question is, are your slides going to be available for others to have?
Sure, yes, I had sent them to Nicole, and actually Nicole, if you want to put them in a PDF, or I can and resend it if you want, but sure, you're more than welcome to send them.
And I can post them on our website.
Great. Okay, one question, Jennifer, is which areas in Baltimore do you see as transformative placemaking? Do you see Port Covington in that light, EBDI, Harbor Point? Yeah, which are good ones, which aren't so good?
Sure, and this sort of gets to some of my comments about how do we identify these places, and we're actually doing a lot of work in this area to identify. We're now using this language around kind of regionally significant activity centers, and we're doing a whole lot of quantitative work across metros around the country to try to understand where you see assets kind of clustering and connecting in place. But what we know from this work, certainly, and it's intuitive, right, is that these places aren't all the same, right? So when you talk about, well, like what places are best, or what places are there, there is no sort of best. Places are different from one another, and they serve very different roles in their economies, and they need different things. So in some places, say here, a place like Harbor East, the challenges there might be less around some of the the physical investments, say, but we might have real affordability challenges, and that goes for places around the country where you've seen a lot of investment, but yet they're pretty exclusive places in terms of who's able to, say, live in that geography. In other places, you have assets. Maybe they're around a university, for example, around a hospital system, where there's a lot of small businesses that are kind of clustered but flying under the radar, but have just been historically disinvested in. And we know, anybody knows Baltimore, knows the challenges that we face here in terms of the long disinvestment that's occurred, going back many, many decades and continuing now, where they might have transit assets, they've got great architecture, they've got small businesses, maybe anchor institutions, and yet just aren't seeing the same level of investment. In other places, even around the region, you can look at some of our business parks, for example, like Columbia Gateway, where there's a lot of jobs clustered in a place, and yet they've got some real physical challenges. And recognizing that, that's an area too. I've had, a lot of conversations, not super lately, not since COVID, but prior to, of recognizing that, wow, we're in an area where if we can't even have workers grab a cup of coffee, we're going to have trouble attracting and retaining talent. So there's an area where you might have this kind of clustering and there's real potential, but they need to really focus on like the physical fabric of their place. So my point is that you've got a lot of these areas, but they play different roles and they need different things. And that really takes engaging with the stakeholders that are in these places who know their place best to understand what their needs, what their opportunities are, what their assets are, and what are the challenges that are facing these places.
Thunderstorms possible till 9 o'clock tonight, so there must be something weird going on.
Jennifer, how does infrastructure funding from the federal government potentially support innovative placemaking?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a good question, especially now, right? Where there's potentially some opportunities we didn't have before. So, I mean, I think the simplest, answer is what are we spending money on, right? No doubt across the country, we've got infrastructure challenges in terms of, roads and bridges and things that need attention, and that have, don't score well on all the engineers' scorecards. But we've had a real imbalance, of course, across the country in terms of what we're investing in. And we've spent a long time investing in infrastructure that supports automobiles and not so much in infrastructure that supports people, pedestrians, and certainly in transit. And so when we, as we consider this new federal resources, this is one of the key ways to support transformative placemaking is to invest in the kind of infrastructure that allows better connectivity, into transit, into sidewalks, into bikes, into things that allow more walkability and just overall more connectivity. And this should really be, a goal. And the theory of change here is this isn't just a goal in and of itself, but it's really what we need to support a stronger economic ecosystem as well. And this, again, coming back to this kind of intersectionality of transformative placemaking, when you think about something like small business development, right? We focus a lot and necessarily so on things like, credit access, business assistance for small businesses. But the physical fabric matters too. If the streets are unsafe, the sidewalks are in disrepair, people can't access a commercial quarter via transit, it also, diminishes foot traffic for businesses. If the lights are out, it gives people, a feeling that they might not want to patronize. So when we think about, say, economic activity for small, and driving more activity in a business quarter, by just one example, it also means that we need to be investing in the kind of built environment, including infrastructure, broadband being another major one, obviously, that supports that kind of economic activity. And I could keep giving other examples of where we need to be thinking about our infrastructure investments, from broadband to water to transit, to road repair, in ways that better support the kind of economy that we want to achieve.
What strategy was employed in order for Capitol Hill and Anacostia to bridge their differences?
Yeah. So, I mean, that was part of the motivation for this, for the whole project, right? To build this, literally build the bridge across the river, using old kind of pylons that were, that were already there, and bridging Anacostia and Capitol Hill, and to create really a recreational space that would serve both kinds of communities. And that's really where it started, where the effort started to say, hey, how do we invest in this, to again create new green space, but also really, I mean, quite literally connect these neighborhoods, physically connecting them, but also then connecting people who may not have tended to interact with, much with one another because they had a river between them. But what they found throughout this whole process was that as they got into it, and they, as I mentioned, they had, I think, literally hundreds of community meetings to really understand what is it that the residents of these communities actually want from this space? What do they want to see? How do they want to use it? There was a real recognition that there's a whole lot of other challenges in these communities, around, workforce development and access to jobs and, business development needs. And so they kind of use this effort and this organizing effort and all the effort around gaining community input to broaden their scope beyond, just focusing on the park itself, on the bridge and the park itself, but to develop this broader plan around, equitable development that focused on things like workforce and business assistance and other things. And what was also interesting too, and we have a blog about this, was how then, by virtue of having that kind of organizational structure in place, how they were able to be more responsive in COVID-19 too, around food assistance and other things, because they were already organized and they already knew the community and they were already working with the community. So it enabled them to kind of quickly pivot to how are we addressing some of these immediate and kind of emergency needs in the community. And in fact, not just there, but around the country, that's why I focus a lot, and why it's really a key part of our framework is around this civic infrastructure organizing, because it's really the organizing that's kind of the lever to make all these other outcomes happen. This isn't just about, we see what happens when communities are just kind of left to their own devices and aren't able to organize among themselves or kind of have an infrastructure to do that, and certainly aren't well positioned to advocate, for their needs, advocate, for needs from the public sector, advocate for even, for the philanthropic sector. And so by having that kind of organizational structure, it allows them to sort of set this vision. But what we found during COVID around the country was a lot of these organizations, Main Street organizations, for example, we saw it, here, BIDS and other types of these hyper-local structures already kind of then had that infrastructure in place to be able to, help their businesses because they knew who they were, right? They knew they had the relationships, they were able to identify what those needs were. And we did a whole bunch of interviewing kind of in the early months and then last summer around COVID, and really found that it was by virtue of the organizations, which again were enabled because they were place-based, because they were focused on their community, kind of put them in a better position to be able to offer that kind of assistance.
Klaus Philipson points to there only being 15% of the US retail in walkable settings, and asks, is there any research indicating a renaissance of walkable mom and pop retail?
Mm-hmm. It's a complicated story, and actually I'll point you to just another resource on this. We released a series of briefs back in December. We kind of collectively called them the Great Real Estate Reset, that laid out a whole bunch of trends around sort of demographics and housing, retail trends, office trends, to essentially say, hey, here's what's happening in these sectors, even pre-COVID, right? And things that were going to be exacerbated by COVID, and to say this is what we're seeing. And yet the real estate industry isn't quite keeping up. And so it was a bit of a call to action for the industry, which isn't just private sector, but the public sector obviously as well plays a role in real estate. We need to be rethinking a few things. And from here, we're going to be doing a whole bunch more work on, well, what does that actually mean? What are the solutions? But in the retail space particularly, so on one hand, we had, built an awful lot of suburban retail. which you look around the country and we can see the obsolescence of some of it. I mean, we over retailed in a lot of places. At the same time that particularly in some communities, even some of the same places that are over retailed at the regional level are under retailed at the neighborhood level. Either they're under retailed, and this is particularly in lower income or minority communities, or the kind of retail that is there is more or less predatory, right? It's a lot of your dollar stores and other things that squeeze out the ability of other businesses to kind of gain a foothold in those kind of markets. So it's this really kind of divergent story. On one hand, you've got over retailing. You can see the death of a lot of suburban malls, many of which are, some of which are being repurposed in a whole bunch of different ways. At the same time, other places are under retailed. I think what will be interesting is, obviously we've had online retail predated COVID. Now it's really accelerated. But what that means over the long haul and what it means for rethinking retail. And I think the places that you see still being somewhat successful are those that provide a different kind of experience, right? The kind of retail that, that you're not going to get online, where you're going because you're shopping, you're getting a bite to eat, you're with other people, there's a social experience. There's unique, maybe you're looking for something unique that you can't get online. And so it's sort of part of the whole retail experience package. And I think we're seeing some of those places, they even weathered COVID reasonably well, in part based on their density and proximity too, that they were ever able to kind of leverage that a little bit. At the same time that, it probably doesn't bode too well for some of the other places. The kind of retail that's located in malls, for example, that's kind of neither fish nor fowl, right? You're not getting really the experience, the uniqueness out of the retail, and you might as well just buy it online. And I think that's part of what we're seeing in some of the suburban shopping malls. When you look at Sears and JCPenney and some of the stores that haven't been doing so well, I think there are probably some pretty obvious reasons why. So moving forward, I think time will tell, and that we need to be investing in thinking about what that retail experience looks like, and particularly with an eye to how we support businesses in areas that are under retailed and underserved, that simply don't have the kind of amenities and services and goods that a community needs.
Can you talk a little more about Port Covington? It received a lot of support from the city in the way of a TIF with a huge infrastructure. It's been scaled back to a degree, only a single developer there. And it has the potential to be kind of a separate part from the rest of the city. How could your principles potentially apply there?
Sure. No, it's a good question. And it's an interesting one because we're, in a way, it's not fully a blank slate. There's obviously, things happening already in Port Covington, but as it grows over time, and if it sort of fulfills even some of the ambitions that were in the original plan, it's a great project to say, how do we maybe do things a little bit differently. And so I think, like with any of these large scale, what we've called in other work that we've done, kind of catalytic development, where you've really got large scale development happening over a pretty long period of time. I think here is where, look, the framework really applies. I mean, there's no doubt that there is an opportunity, from an economic development standpoint. Under Armour is going to be there, how they, leverage that for other types of economic activity, job growth. But then how are they building, a supportive built environment? And by that meaning, hey, they could be building this to look like, any old suburb somewhere, for example, if they weren't attentive to the, creating a built environment where people actually wanted to be, green spaces, small streets, walkability. And I think they are, from the plans I've seen, really trying to be attentive to that and learn from places, here and elsewhere around the world. And, it's tough sometimes because I think when you see a lot of the new development that grows up sometimes, on areas that don't have kind of a historic fabric there, it can be easy to miss the mark. We saw this in a lot of kind of the innovation district growth that was happening, not just here, but around the globe, where there was a lot of rapid development, a lot of jobs, a lot of, stuff, but really missed it on the built environment. I mean, just creating kind of sterile places that even if they were highly landscaped, they weren't really attentive to creating the kind of atmosphere where people, that were really human scaled. So I think here, being attentive to that's going to be really important, like it would be anytime you're doing a fair bit of, new development over a long period of time. And with that built environment, it really comes down to the social. How are you, again, creating kind of the physical realm that both supports the economy that's there and the businesses that are there, but also makes it a place where people gather, where people want to be, where people feel welcome and comfortable. And that certainly includes people from the surrounding communities. I think that this is an area that will really miss the mark if it's being, built and it only feels welcoming for some parts of the population and not for others. So that's about the built environment. It's about accessibility and connectivity to the rest of the city. It's also about the kind of programming that goes on there. What happens in the spaces, and who then might be attracted to the spaces based on, the kind of activities that are happening there. So I think the framework, this is a great chance to say, how would this framework, play out in a large scale development such as this?
Okay. Joe Consoli points out that the value of green areas in downtown areas can bring people back to office spaces and increase values for surrounding properties, and that the pandemic has accelerated the dysfunctional obsolescence of Class C or worse buildings.
Mm-hmm.
What do you feel about a TDR program, transfer of development rights to other properties, and can some kind of land value transfer be monetized to encourage these older buildings to serve as an amenity to the remaining buildings?
Yeah, I mean, these are things that have been, tried, I think, with some success elsewhere. This isn't an area where I have a ton of expertise. Actually, some of you on the line might be able to answer that question better than I can. Overall, I think, these are exactly the kind of things that we need to explore, particularly for downtown areas that have really been hit hard by COVID. Clearly, downtown areas are where a lot of white collar jobs, the exact jobs that people are working remote, are, have left, and vacancy rates are very high here. They're very high, across downtowns across the country, particularly in those areas that in some that already had too much office space to begin with, because a lot of these things were starting before COVID. We talk a lot about COVID, but actually office vacancies were rising in a lot of downtowns even prior to. So this just accelerated the whole trend. And then, of course, having a pretty decimating effect on all the businesses that depend on it. So overall, I think this is the time to be creative, whether it's a new, structures like this, convergence, how are we thinking about, as if a lot of employers wind up going to hybrid models and the need for office space declines to some extent, what does that mean for office space that is left, and what are the other opportunities to convert it to housing or other things? What does that mean for the interior spaces too? I think that's on top of mind for everyone, of how they design their office space that works better in kind of a hybrid kind of environment. But it does involve investing in the green spaces. It involves investing in the kind of spaces that make people want to be downtown, to live, to work, to recreate. Here, clearly, this also is going to be really important on what happens to the harbor, which is right there, and as we all know, has really seen better days. But how are you investing in that kind of physical fabric that makes people want to be there, that helps businesses to thrive, and that does so in an authentic way? I mean, I think that's going to be the key for Baltimore, particularly for the harbor, to be investing in the areas so that they benefit the people in the city, so that it's not just about attracting people from outside the city in, but really doing so in a way that that is what the residents of the city want. And if you do that well, the rest will follow.
What are some of the specific techniques used in Philadelphia to create an inclusionary place, and how successful has the effort been?
Mm-hmm. We did a lot of work. I mean, Philadelphia is a really big place, so I'll sort of answer that question looking particularly at the University City District area, because I know it a little bit better, and know some of the organizations there, including the University City District, which I cited. So, UCD has been, around for a decent amount of time. It's an organization that's funded. It sort of functions like a bid, but it's not financed the same way because it actually is financed by a lot of the anchor institutions in the area. But, they focused, a lot of their work, I think, like a lot of these organizations, on kind of, clean and green and safe and programming. And I think UCD for a long time, and maybe rightly so, was somewhat criticized because they were doing a lot of the work, and hey, it was benefiting UCD. If you've been to University City, you know how much it's grown in the last number of years. So much development's happening, but the surrounding area, of West Philadelphia, still faces a lot of challenges. I mean, just high poverty rates, high unemployment rates, very kind of disconnected from the rest of the growth that's happening in the area. But I think UCD, has really tried to be attentive to that over time. And, these are larger forces that go beyond what any single organization can do. I think what they have tried to do is, one, I mentioned things like the Just Spaces Initiative, where they're trying to be much more attentive to who's using the spaces. They're making all this investment. Why are we only seeing, students or others who work in this area and not the surrounding communities? What's going on there and how do we fix it? They've also, and I think this is really unique in terms of trying to be, create, a more equitable and inclusive kind of community in that area. They launched something several years ago called the West Philly Skills Initiative. And it's unique because it's a place-based workforce initiative where they work with the anchor institutions, particularly around occupations where there was a really, really high turnover. And then they engage community residents around, and they work with other job training entities to train people for those jobs. So it was helping to relieve pain points for the institutions themselves while also employing West Philadelphia residents. And it's seen a lot of success in terms of them training and placing people into jobs that are now in their neighborhood, as opposed to taking, 4 buses to get to work. They've expanded the program. They work with anchors, healthcare institutions, and security occupations, and they actually have their own landscaping company. So now they're hiring a lot of local residents to do their own landscaping in the properties that they manage. So that's, one way that I think that they're trying to move beyond just let's invest in kind of pretty places, but really do so in a way that provides more opportunity for residents of the area.
Well, I think we're about at 1 o'clock, but let me ask you one more question. As I had mentioned before, we heard Stephen Walters talk previously to us about thinking or saying that cities should not be doing anything specific for development, for specific favoring certain projects over others, but rather should focus on reducing the tax rate in a community. And he gives the example of both San Francisco and Boston, and once they cut their tax rate, development flourished. What is your take on that?
Sure. Look, I think it's certainly a fair question to say, does Baltimore City or any place have a competitive tax rate? And I think it's fairly widely accepted that in an ideal world, we would have a little bit more parity with the surrounding jurisdictions, to the extent that that's keeping people in jobs, from locating in the city. But I think it's really oversimplistic to say this is like the magic bullet solution, for a whole bunch of reasons. For one thing, and this is why, a lot of cities find themselves in this trap anyway. It's pretty obvious that as populations decline or as, businesses decline, if you want to keep up, basic services, you have to have the revenue to do it, right? And so you can see how cities fall into kind of this trap around property taxes, exacerbated in a lot of cities like here too. Even if anchors are paying, taxes and, pilots, payment in lieu of taxes, it still may not be making up for the fact that you have a lot of untaxable property. That's just cities, right? Between nonprofit anchor institutions and other things. So you can see where the problem lies, but to say that just reducing the tax rate is going to solve everything, clearly it isn't the case. You have to be making the kind of investments, and that takes resources to be able to do it, to make cities and following the trends. I think, people and businesses, for a whole bunch of reasons that I talked about, want to be in more dynamic areas. And we haven't been meeting that demand, frankly. People say, well, the market demands, suburban development. That's where people want to live and work. It's also a lot of what we built over a long period of time. So we have an opportunity to take advantage of the fabric that already exists here, but it takes resources, public sector resources, private sector resources to do it. And that means you need to have a tax for this kind of work. And I think in terms of Boston and San Francisco, I haven't, dug deep into the data, but I can say that I don't think it was just slicing, cutting property taxes that made those places successful. These are, there's a whole bunch of other reasons. Look at the tech economy and how it's been concentrating that have caused reinvestment in San Francisco. Same with Boston, right? They, for reasons of both serendipity and the anchor institutions that were already there, the big companies that chose to locate there, that's helped fuel a lot of their growth. Over time, I don't think at all this was a matter of just cutting property taxes. And in any case, I think that we find, whether it's taxes or just real estate values, cheap isn't it. None of these places became successful because they were ever necessarily cheap. Maybe at one point in time, but people are still going to these places, right? As expensive as they are, COVID being maybe a slight blip, but at the end of the day, it's not. People aren't flocking in droves to Boston or the Bay Area, New York, or any place else because of their low cost structure. So there must be something else going on here. And so anyway, long-winded way to say, yeah, all cities should be attentive to their property tax structure, but there's no way that this is going to solve any community's issues.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jennifer. We very much appreciate it. Terrific talk, and glad that we were able to turn out so many people.
Thanks so much for the opportunity. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Jennifer. And a reminder, come join us all, one and all, next month when we'll hear about construction costs. Thanks so much.
Great. Thanks.
Bye.